Hello friends. Tell me honestly, what is the first thing that comes to mind when you hear the word Iran? A nuclear bomb. The Ayatollahs. Death to America. Women in hijabs fleeing the morality police. Terrorists funded by Tehran. An axis of evil. A country that seems to exist solely to frighten the rest of the world, doing so with an almost religious zeal. But here is a question worth asking before we accept this image as complete. Why has a country with a 3,000-year-old civilization, a land that gave the world its architecture, poetry, mathematics, and even the very word paradise, become the boogeyman of global politics? What transformed one of humanity's oldest cultural centers into an isolated fortress that the world either fears or fails to understand? Or perhaps both at once? That is the question of today's story. Because Iran is not just a country with a difficult government. It is a civilization that survived for millennia through openness. It absorbed conquerors, repurposed foreign ideas as its own, and grew stronger with every blow. And then, at one specific moment, it chose the opposite strategy. A wall. Not a wall of stone, but of ideology. And that wall stands to this day, defining everything, from nuclear negotiations to whether an Iranian woman can walk the street with her hair uncovered. Today we journey from the Arab conquest of the 7th century to the nuclear deal of 2015. 14 centuries, several revolutions, the first oil of the Middle East, 444 days of hostages, and a question Iran has yet to answer. Which survival strategy is the right one? The open garden or the fortress? If you haven't heard the first part of this dilogy, Persia, the garden that gave the world paradise, it is already on the channel. The link is in the description. But even without it, you will find your way. This story stands on its own. Settle in, get comfortable. If you have tea, now is the time to pour it. Iran is not a story to be rushed. And as always, if you feel the evening promises to be an interesting one, leave a like in advance. Like a Persian merchant paying for goods before seeing them, trusting the seller's reputation. If you don't like it, you can take it back at the end. Tell us in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you. We are truly curious about your geography. And if you have ideas for future stories, write them there as well. We read everything. The Arab conquest and the Persian paradox. It is the 7th century. The Arabian Peninsula. An army arrives carrying not just swords, but a new idea of how the world is ordered. The year is 651. The last Sassanid Shah, Yazdijerd III, flees from the Arab forces deep into his own country and dies at the hands of a miller somewhere in Khorasan. Not in battle, not by a conqueror's blade, but by a random crime against a penniless fugitive. The Persian Empire, which for 4 centuries had been the chief rival of Rome, vanishes not with a roar, but with a strangled throat. But, and this is most important, Persian culture does not vanish with it. The first decades of Arab rule are a true administrative paradox. The Caliphate conquered Iran, but it was physically impossible to govern it without the Iranians. Irrigation systems, tax collection, urban administration, diplomacy, all of this relied on the people who grew up in the Sassanid Empire and knew how it functioned. The Arab rulers were better at war. The Iranian officials were better at governance. A compromise was inevitable. By the 9th century, semi-autonomous Persian dynasties began to emerge within the Caliphate. The Tahirids were the first to dare rule Khorasan in the name of the Caliph, but they did so in the Persian language and with Persian courtly culture. They were followed by the Saffarids, descendants of simple craftsmen who built a dynasty almost without aristocratic roots. And finally, the Samanids, the most brilliant of them all. The Samanids ruled from Bokhara, a city that, during their time, became one of the chief intellectual centers of the Islamic world. Their court spoke Persian. Their poets wrote in Persian. Their most prominent court poet, Rudaki, who would later be called the father of Persian poetry, composed verses in a language that, despite 2 centuries of Arab conquest, had not just survived but blossomed. This was not a rebellion against Islam. This was a Persian version of Islam. A new religion embedded into an old cultural frame, like a precious stone in a pre-made setting. The mechanism we saw in our first episode begins again. The conqueror comes with a sword and a new faith, and gradually begins to speak the language of those he subdued. Not because he was forced to, but because Persian culture possessed what the young caliphate lacked. Depth, refinement, and a 1,000-year-old tradition of what power should look like. But there is one difference from previous conquests. The Greeks, the Parthians, even the early Sassanids, They all absorbed and changed physically, dissolving into the local environment. Islam is different. It comes not just as a political force, but as a universal idea about the order of the world. It can be accepted, it can be adapted, but it can no longer be fully digested as Alexander the Great was. The Iranians would become sincere Muslims. And yet they remained Iranians to their core. This was the balance that would hold for several more centuries, until the Turks arrived from the Central Asian steppes. And the mechanism would work once more. The age of the steppe nomads. The 10th century. From the east, where the inhabited land ends and the steppe begins, new players arrive. Turkic tribes, first as mercenaries for the caliphate, then as its de facto masters. The Ghaznavids took Khorasan. The Seljuks soon after took almost everything else. It would seem like yet another catastrophe for Persian culture. Conquerors with a foreign language, a foreign memory, and foreign ideas of order. But look at what happens at the court of Mahmud of Ghazni, one of the most powerful rulers of his time. His army speaks Turkic. His correspondence with other courts is conducted in Arabic, the language of Islamic scholarship. But his court poetry, his ceremonies, his concept of what a true monarch looks like, all of this is Persian. Because by that point, Persian culture was the only available language of power and prestige in this part of the world. If you wanted to be seen as a civilized ruler, rather than a steppe chieftain with a bow and horses, you invited Persian poets, built palaces in the Persian style, and commissioned Persian manuscripts for your library. It was at Mahmud's court that Ferdowsi completed the Shahnameh, the grand epic of the Persian kings, which took 30 years of his life and 50,000 rhyming couplets. We told this story in the first part of our dilogy. Here we need only recall the main point. Ferdowsi received silver instead of the promised gold, wrote a biting satire about the stingy Shah and fled the court. But the Shahnameh remained. A text that anchored Persian identity in a form that could not be destroyed, even if one wished to, for it had already spread in thousands of copies throughout the Islamic world. The Seljuks, who followed the Ghaznavids, acted with the same logic but on a much larger scale. Their empire at its peak spanned from the Mediterranean Sea to Central Asia. They were Turks by origin, Sunnis by faith, and the new masters of the Islamic world by force. But their administration functioned in Persian. Their madrasas taught in Persian. Their greatest vizier, Nizam al-Mulk, a man who effectively ruled the empire under two successive sultans, wrote the Siyasatnama, a treatise on the art of statecraft. In Persian, of course. And this text would become mandatory reading for rulers for centuries to come. The Mongol storm and the scar of history. There is something almost paradoxical in how this works. The conqueror arrives with force and wins on the battlefield. But cultural superiority proves stronger than military might. Not because the Persians put up some organized resistance, but because their civilization simply had more answers to the questions posed by the daily management of a great state. How do you collect taxes? How do you build canals? How do you write letters so they are respected? How do you decorate a palace so that guests understand? A man of power and taste lives here. This knowledge is thousands of years old. It cannot be replaced by a sword. The mechanism works for the fourth time. And as it does, it seems as if it will always be so, that any conqueror will eventually become part of Persia, dissolve into it, and begin to think in its categories. That this civilizational gravity is as inescapable as a law of physics. But in the 13th century, a force arrives from the east that initially seems the same. Another steppe people with horses, bows, and an unquenchable thirst for new lands. But this force proves to be fundamentally different. So different that the mechanism of absorption fails for the first time. Though as we shall see, not forever. The Mongols are on their way. Genghis Khan crosses the Sir Darya River and enters lands that are, at that time, among the wealthiest and most densely populated in the world. The Khwarezmian Empire, Samarkand, Bokhara, Merv, Nishapur, cities with hundreds of thousands of people, with universities, bazaars, mosques, and underground canals that water gardens in the heart of the desert. A civilization at the peak of its maturity, and it has no inkling of what is approaching from the east. What follows is unlike any previous conquest in Iranian history. The Greeks came with ideas and admiration for Persian culture. The Arabs with a new faith but respect for conquered peoples. The Turks with ambitions and a natural readiness to adopt foreign ways. The Mongols arrive with a system whose only documented goal is to break any resistance so brutally and demonstratively that the next city surrenders without a fight. This is not cruelty for cruelty's sake. This is the cold logistics of fear. Nishapur, the city where Omar Khayyam was born, one of the primary cultural centers of the Islamic world, is destroyed in 1221. According to Persian sources, the Mongols ordered even the cats and dogs to be killed, so that no living creature remained as a witness. Merv, which by various estimates held between 100,000 and 700,000 inhabitants, was destroyed that same year. A traveler passing by several decades later describes a field of skulls stretching to the horizon where streets and bazaars once stood. The irrigation systems, built and perfected over 1,000 years, were destroyed or abandoned. Without them, the lands that fed millions turned into desert. This was not just the killing of people. This was the murder of the infrastructure that made their very existence possible. Some regions of Iran never regained their pre-war population density. Not after 100 years, not after 200. A demographic wound that took generations to heal. Genghis Khan's grandson, Hulagu, takes Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. A city that had been the intellectual heart of the Islamic world for 2 centuries. The caliph is wrapped in a carpet and trampled by horses. The Mongols did not wish to spill royal blood upon the earth, it was a taboo. The libraries, of which there were dozens in Baghdad at the time, burn or go to the bottom of the Tigris. Legend says the river ran black for days from the ink of the manuscripts. The end of the Abbasid Caliphate. And with it, the end of an entire era of Islamic civilization. The return of the mechanism. There is something almost impossible in what happens next. A country destroyed to its foundations, with cities turned to ash, with irrigation systems lying in ruins, with a population reduced manifold. This country somehow retains enough cultural memory to start the mechanism once more. Not immediately, not easily, but it starts. This was the most brutal conquest in Iranian history. And it would seem to be the first real case where the mechanism of absorption should have stopped forever. For how can you absorb a force that methodically destroys the very things that make absorption possible? The cities, the libraries, the craftsmen, the poets. But the mechanism works. Simply slower than before. Hulagu Khan dies in 1265 as the ruler of a state he himself destroyed and was now trying to administer. His ilkhanate spans Iran, Iraq, and parts of Anatolia and the Caucasus. The capital, Tabriz, a city that in a few decades would transform from a provincial center into one of the most important trade hubs between China and the Mediterranean. The Mongol administration sits on Persian land and daily faces the same question as all its predecessors. How to govern a people whose culture is incomparably more complex than your own. The early Ilkhans were pagans or Nestorian Christians. They were relatively tolerant of different religions, which, after the brutality of the conquest, was already a relief for Iran. Persian officials returned to administrative posts, for without them the apparatus simply does not function. Persian poets reappear at court, for without them the court looks barbaric. Persian architects begin to rebuild destroyed cities and, along the way, teach their Mongol patrons to distinguish good art from bad. The mechanism starts again, but slower and with more resistance than ever before, for the trauma is too fresh. The Persian intellectuals who agree to serve the Mongol Ilkhans do so with the realization that the alternative is the disappearance of everything that remains. This is not the enthusiastic acceptance of new masters seen with the Greeks or Arabs. This is pragmatic survival through cultural presence. Ghazan Khan, the grandson of Hulagu, the same line that destroyed Baghdad and drowned the manuscripts in the Tigris, converts to Islam. Not formally, not for diplomacy. He converts sincerely, studies Arabic and Persian, and surrounds himself with Muslim scholars. His court commissions magnificent Persian miniatures, illustrated manuscripts where Mongol rulers are depicted in the Persian style, with Persian attributes of power. The conqueror begins to paint himself in the image of those he conquered. Under Ghazan and his successor Al-Jaytu, the Ilkhanate experiences a brief but brilliant cultural flowering. The Persian historian Rashid al-Din, Ghazan's vizier, writes the Jami al-Tawarik, a collection of chronicles, the first truly universal history from Adam to the Mongol Khans, written in Persian. This is not just a chronicle, it is an attempt to weave the Mongol conquest into the Persian cultural narrative, to make it part of an unbroken Iranian history. The victors embed themselves into the memory of the defeated. The Ilkhanate collapses in 1335, too quickly to be fully digested into Persian culture. But the precedent is set. Even the Mongols, after a generation, begin to speak Persian and think in Persian categories. The mechanism worked this time as well. The birth of the fortress, the Safavids, it worked for the last time in full and the last time in quite that way. For the next great change would be different. Not a conqueror from without gradually becoming one of their own, but a ruler from within who consciously decides to make his country a stranger to everyone around it. A young military commander named Ismail, he is 14 years old when he begins his campaign and 16 when he completes it, enters Tabriz and proclaims himself Shah. Behind him lie several years of a lightning military campaign that united scattered Iranian lands under one banner for the first time since the Mongol collapse. Before him is a country that has been Muslim for 850 years but has never had a single state form of this faith. The next morning after entering the city, he would give it one. Ismail proclaimed Shia Islam as the state religion of Iran, forcibly under threat of death. A country whose population was majority Sunni at the time is converted to Shi'ism over several decades through the execution of the defiant, the exile of Sufi orders, and the massive invitation of Shia theologians from Arab lands where they were a minority. This is not a gradual cultural transformation. This is a state project with a strict deadline. What? The answer lies to the west. There stands the Ottoman Empire, one of the most powerful states of its time, Sunni by faith and aggressive in its ambitions. Between Iran and the Ottomans, there is constant border tension, disputes over land and most importantly, the question of who is the true heir to the Islamic tradition. Ismail understands. If Iran remains Sunni, its subjects can always be called upon to defect to the side of the Ottoman Sultan as fellow believers. Religious difference is not about theology, it is a border that cannot be crossed with a banner of jihad. This is a fundamentally new idea in Iranian history. For millennia the country survived through absorption, letting in foreigners, making them their own, dissolving them. Now, for the first time, it consciously builds a wall. Not a physical one, but an ideological one. You are different. This is the new formula for relations with neighbors. Not come in and become part of us, but there is a boundary between us and it is sacred. A change that would define Iranian foreign and domestic policy for 5 centuries to come. The Safavid state is built around this idea. The Shia clergy becomes the pillar of power. The Shah and the Ayatollahs form a symbiosis where the former provides the latter with protection and resources, and the latter give the former legitimacy. Theological schools, mosques, pilgrimage routes to Shia shrines in Iraq. All of this is funded and controlled by the state. Shi'ism ceases to be just a religion. It becomes an Iranian national idea, packaged in a theological form. Strategic isolation and the Golden Age. But there is a downside. The country, having closed itself off from the Sunni world, finds itself in strategic isolation. To the east, warlike Uzbek Khanates, also Sunni. To the west, the Ottomans. To the south, the Portuguese who have just appeared in the Persian Gulf and control the sea routes. Iran is surrounded. And now, this isolation has not only a geographical dimension but an ideological one. Allies are harder to find when your identity is built on being different from everyone else. Ismail loses the Battle of Calderon in 1514. Ottoman artillery shatters his cavalry, and the Shah himself narrowly escapes capture. He returns to Tabriz a different man, withdrawn, prone to drinking, stripped of his former military confidence. He dies at 36. But the system he built will outlive him by 2.5 centuries. Because ideological walls, unlike physical ones, do not require constant repair. They are held up by fear, tradition, and generations of people who grew up inside them. The fortress is built. Now it must be decorated. Shah Abbas I comes to power in 1587 and finds the country in a catastrophic state. The Ottomans occupy the northwest, the Uzbeks ravage the east, and internal tribal chiefs behave like independent rulers. The Safavid state, which Ismail built with such rigidity, has in 70 years turned into a confederation of semi-autonomous feudal lords barely holding together. Abbas is 20 years old and he inherits not a throne but a headache. What he does next can be described in one word: reorganization. He breaks the power of the tribal chiefs, replacing them with gulams, slave soldiers, mostly of Armenian and Georgian origin, personally loyal to the Shah. He creates a regular artillery force. He reclaims lost lands. By the end of his reign, he transforms Iran into a regional superpower. In 1598, Abbas moves the capital from Qazvin to Isfahan, a city in the center of the country. And here begins what will transform Isfahan into one of the most beautiful cities in the world. Nakshi Jahan Square, image of the world, becomes the heart of the new capital. Nearly 500 meters long and 160 wide. It is surrounded by the Great Mosque, the Sheikh Lotfallah Mosque, the Bazaar, and the Ali Kapu Palace. Everything is in turquoise ceramic, everything in geometric patterns. Persian carpets of this time reach such perfection they are purchased by the courts of Louis XIV and Charles II. A golden age occurs inside the fortress. It turns out that closeness does not kill culture. Sometimes it concentrates it. European travelers write with undisguised admiration. The French jeweler Jean Chardin leaves a conclusion: Isfahan is half the world. This phrase would become an aphorism. Abbas I dies in 1629, but he leaves a poison in his legacy. Just as Ismail built an ideological wall against external enemies, Abbas built a system that protected power from internal rivals. He personally ordered the blinding or killing of several of his sons. Princes began to be isolated in the harem, away from the army, away from governance, away from the real world. The golden age and the seeds of decline in one place. Shah Abbas has a problem he cannot solve alone. To the west, the Ottoman Empire controls the land routes. This means that Iranian silk, the country's most valuable export, must either go through Ottoman customs or find a detour. Abbas finds that detour in the form of Europeans. He receives the Shirley brothers as personal guests, using them as military advisors and diplomats. In 1622, Iranian troops, together with the English East India Company, take Hormuz. This was not just a military operation. This was the first joint venture in Iranian history with a European commercial entity. Through this partnership, the English secured trading privileges, while Iran gained direct access to the sea without the need for a Portuguese middleman. The deal was entirely pragmatic, driven by a logic that feels strikingly modern. Iranian silk would travel to Europe by sea, bypassing the heavy taxes of the Ottoman customs. In exchange, technology flowed into Iran, primarily military technology. English and Dutch engineers helped modernize the Iranian artillery. Armenian merchants from New Julfa, a suburb of Isfahan, became the essential intermediaries in this trade between Iran and Europe. Shah Abbas had consciously relocated the Armenian community closer to his capital, transforming them into a sophisticated tool for foreign commerce. The system was efficient and inventive, but there was a boundary that Abbas never crossed. This openness was selective, controlled, and instrumental. The Europeans were welcomed as trading partners and military allies, but never as cultural models to be imitated. There were missionaries at court, but no mass conversions to Christianity. Foreign technologies were borrowed, but foreign ideas about the organization of society were not permitted in the conversation. The fortress opened its gates for silk and gunpowder, but not for the Enlightenment that was just beginning to stir in Europe. There is something symptomatic of all subsequent Iranian history in this. The country's ability to take what is concrete and useful, technology, goods, alliances, while rejecting the package that comes with them. The mindset, the value system, and the evolving ideas of how a state should be governed. One could call this wisdom, or one could call it a vulnerability. For while the world outside was changing rapidly, the fortress remained ideologically locked. The shadow of the harem. When Shah Abbas died, his successors were less talented, more suspicious, and far less capable of balancing openness and isolation with his mastery. Trade with Europe continued, but it lacked the strategic flexibility that had defined Abbas's reign. Iranian silk was still prized and Persian carpets were still bought, but the machinery of the state began to creak. The problem was not external. The problem was that inside the fortress, a generation was growing up that did not know what it meant to be outside. Shah Safi, who succeeded Abbas in 1229, was a grandson raised entirely within the harem. He had no military experience, no administrative practice, and no concept of what the country looked like beyond the palace walls. He was suspicious and prone to cruelty and drink. In his first years of rule, he executed most of the experienced ministers and generals, those who had served Abbas and kept the state functioning. This was not an exception, it became the system. The Safavid practice of isolating princes had its own cold logic. Abbas, who had killed or blinded his own sons out of fear of conspiracy, solved the problem of rivals radically. His successors went further. Princes were no longer just isolated from the army, they were isolated from reality itself. The harem, with its eunuchs, concubines, and court intrigues, became the only environment in which future shahs were raised. A man who had never ridden a horse on campaign, never sat at a negotiation table with tribal chiefs, and never seen the face of a starving province, was now the man governing the state. The result was predictable. Each generation of shahs grew weaker than the last. Power gradually trickled away to courtiers, eunuchs, and queen mothers, people who had access to the shah but bore no responsibility for the nation. The army decayed because no one in the decision-making circle felt the need for a strong military. It was only needed to defend against a foreign enemy, and a foreign enemy seems very distant when you are sitting in the luxury of Isfahan. The fall of Isfahan. Provinces slowly slipped out of control. Tribal chiefs reclaimed the independence that Abbas had worked so hard to break. The irrigation systems, which required constant maintenance and centralized management, began to fail. Trade shriveled, partly due to internal chaos, and partly because European East India companies had found direct sea routes to India and China, no longer needing an Iranian middleman as urgently as before. Isfahan was still beautiful, but that beauty was no longer backed by strength. In 1722, an army emerged from the Afghan mountains under the command of Mir Mahmud Hataki. It was not a large force, nor was it technically advanced, but it was driven by a man who knew exactly what he wanted. The Safavid army went out to meet them and lost in the very first serious battle. The road to Isfahan lay open. Shah Sultan Hussein, the last effective Safavid, tried to organize a defense, but a court that had not known a true threat for decades was simply incapable of functioning in a crisis. After months of siege and famine, Isfahan surrendered. The city that Jean Chardin had called half the world, a century earlier opened its gates to the Afghan army almost without a fight. This was not just a military defeat, it was the collapse of a system that had destroyed itself from within. The wall built by Ismail to protect against external enemies could not protect against internal rot. The fortress fell not because it was stormed from the outside, but because there was no one left inside to defend it. The Safavid state would formally linger for a few more decades in the form of puppet shahs under various regents, but the golden age was over. Isfahan was looted, depopulated, and lost its status as the capital. Persian civilization had survived yet another catastrophe, and it would survive again. But the next attempt to grapple with its own destiny would take place in a very different world, a world where two new empires loomed on the horizon, one from the north and one from the sea. The Great Game in the Qajar era. In 1796, Aga Muhammad Khan Qajar, a tribal chieftain who had been castrated in childhood and became one of the most ruthless rulers in Iranian history, reunified the country after 70 years of chaos. He chose a small town called Tehran as his capital. A year later he was murdered by his own servants, but his dynasty remained for the next 130 years. They would not be the best years in Iranian history. Qajar Iran found itself in a geopolitical vice it did not choose. From the north pressed the Russian Empire, advancing south and swallowing the Caucasian Khanates that had formerly been Iranian vassals. From the south and east stood the British Empire, controlling India and watching vigilantly to ensure Russia did not reach the warm seas. Between these two giants sat Iran, a country with vast territory but no army, no technology, and no finances to defend itself against either. The consequences came quickly and painfully. The Treaty of Gulistan in 1813 saw Iran lose most of the Caucasus to Russia. The Treaty of Turkmenchay in 1828 took the rest, Yerevan, Nakhchivan, and granted Russia the exclusive right to maintain a navy on the Caspian Sea. These treaties were signed after two lost wars where the Iranian army, armed with flintlock muskets and medieval tactics, faced Russian artillery and regular regiments. The gap in weaponry and organization was an abyss. Attempts at reform existed but systematically stalled. Prince Abbas Mirza tried to modernize the army on the European model, inviting French and British instructors and sending Iranian students to study in Europe. These first Iranians to return from Paris and London with technical educations saw clearly the chasm between what was and what could be. But Abbas Mirza died before his father and the reforms were rolled back. The concessions and the tobacco protest. The Qajar Shahs ruled with a luxury the country could not afford. The court in Tehran mimicked European customs. Mirrored halls, French chefs, life-sized photographic portraits. Nasir al-Din Shah traveled to Europe 7 times, returning each time with new ideas about how a modern monarch should look. But there was a void between the appearance of modernity and its substance. Meanwhile, Britain and Russia signed agreements between themselves, without Iran's participation, to decide its fate. The Anglo-Russian Entente of 1907 divided the country into a Russian sphere of influence in the north, a British one in the south, and a neutral strip in the middle. The Iranians were not invited to the negotiations. Their country was the object of the deal, not a subject. This humiliation would leave a scar on the national consciousness for generations. Yet this humiliating position had a reverse side. It was during the Qajar period that Iranian society first began to think in terms of civic rather than just religious identity. The first newspapers appeared, the first intellectuals read Montesquieu and Rousseau, and the first conversations began about a constitution and the rights of citizens. In 1872, Nasir al-Din Shah returned from another European trip, impressed and, as always, broke. The Iranian treasury was chronically empty. To find funds, he signed a concession with the British Baron Julius de Ruyter. It was a total surrender on paper. Ruyter received the exclusive right to build all railways in Iran, develop all mines and manage all factories and customs for 70 years. Lord Curzon would later write that it was the most complete surrender of a country's resources to a foreigner ever seen in history. The concession was eventually cancelled due to outrage from Russia and the Iranian nobility, but the logic remained. In 1890, a new concession gave a Briton named Talbot a 50-year monopoly on the production and sale of all Iranian tobacco. Tobacco was not an abstraction. It was the livelihood of thousands of small producers and merchants. What followed was the first mass civil resistance in Iranian history. The Grand Ayatollah Mirza Hassan Shirazi issued a fatwa. Tobacco was forbidden as long as it remained in foreign hands. Iranians stopped smoking, massively, publicly, and defiantly. Even in the Shah's harem, his concubines broke their hookahs. The clergy and the merchants, the two pillars of Iranian society, united. The Shah retreated, but Iran had to pay compensation, taking out its first foreign loan. The precedent was set. A popular protest, led by the clergy and supported by the bazaar, could stop the Shah. The Constitutional Revolution. Nasir al-Din Shah was assassinated in 1896. His successors were even weaker and more dependent on foreign loans. The country entered the 20th century with an empty treasury and a population that now knew it could take to the streets to demand results. In 1905, several merchants in Tehran were punished with bastinado for the rising price of sugar, prices the governor himself was manipulating. They refused to disperse and sought bast, the traditional Iranian rite of sanctuary, in a mosque. Within weeks, the movement spanned the country, growing from a specific grievance into the first constitutional revolution in the Asian world. In 1906, the weak Muzaffar al-Din Shah signed a decree for the first Iranian parliament, the Majlis. A constitution was adopted, guaranteeing the rights of citizens, freedom of the press, and an independent judiciary. For a country that had known only absolute rule, this was a revolution as profound as the French one. But the revolution had enemies. The new Shah, Muhammad Ali, hated the constitution and turned to the Russian-led Persian Cossack Brigade. In June 1908, the Cossacks surrounded the parliament building and bombarded it with cannons. Leaders were executed or exiled. Britain and Russia watched with satisfaction. A democratic Iran did not suit their interests. However, the revolution survived in the hearts of the people. When revolutionaries from Tabriz took up arms and marched on Tehran, they won. Muhammad Ali fled to Russia. The constitution was restored. But the victory was fragile. When the Majlis invited an American advisor, Morgan Schuster, to fix the nation's finances, Russia issued an ultimatum. Fire Schuster or Russian troops would enter Tehran. The Majlis refused, the troops entered, and Schuster was dismissed. The first Iranian democracy fell under the twin pressure of the Shah from within and the great powers from without. But it left behind the idea that Iranians had the right to choose those who govern them. Black Gold and the Soldier Shah. While these revolutions played out, a British entrepreneur named William Knox Darcy was betting his fortune on Iranian oil. In 1908, after 7 years of failure, oil struck a gusher in Masjed Soliman. It was the first industrial oil in the Middle East. In 1913, Winston Churchill moved the British fleet from coal to oil and bought a controlling stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company for the Crown. Iranian oil became a pillar of British defense strategy. Iranians received only 16% of the profits, if the company decided there were profits to share. The Abadan refinery, the largest in the world, sat on Iranian soil but was British property. Modernization was happening, but it was modernization for the oil, not for Iran. Amidst the chaos of World War I, a man named Reza Khan, a commander of the Cossack Brigade, rose to power. In 1921 he took Tehran. By 1925 he was Shah, founding the Pahlavi dynasty. He modernized Iran through iron and will. He built the Trans-Iranian Railway, opened universities, and forcibly banned women from wearing the veil. In 1935 he officially asked the world to call the country Iran, rather than Persia, a nod to the Aryan roots of the people. Reza Shah admired German efficiency. By the 1930s, Germany was Iran's main trading partner. When World War II began, Britain and the USSR did not trust his neutrality. In 1941 they invaded. The army Reza Shah had spent 20 years building collapsed in days. He was forced to abdicate in favor of his 22-year-old son, Mohammad Reza, and died in exile. The tragedy of Mossadegh. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi inherited the throne, but the true center of the next drama was a man elected by the parliament, Mohammad Mossadegh. A 70-year-old aristocrat and lawyer, Mossadegh was a man of deep convictions. In 1951 he nationalized the oil industry. For Iran this was the return of dignity. For Britain, it was an intolerable strike against their empire. London announced a total boycott of Iranian oil. In 1953, the CIA and MI6 launched Operation Ajax. Through bribed newspapers, orchestrated riots, and paid military officers, they staged a coup. Mossadegh was arrested and spent the rest of his life under house arrest. The Shah returned from abroad, now ruling with American support and no illusions about the source of his power. Operation Ajax was a turning point that rewrote the Iranian relationship with the West forever. A generation of Iranians grew up with the conviction that whenever an Iranian tried to do something just for their country through democratic means, the West would remove them. The conviction that the West would always subvert Iranian sovereignty fueled the 1979 revolution as much as any of Khomeini's theology. Mossadegh lost his office, but his defeat became the most powerful argument for his ideas. In 1963, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi launched a program of radical reforms he called the White Revolution, styled to distinguish it from red communism or black clerical reaction. It was ambitious. Land reform broke up vast feudal estates to redistribute soil to the peasantry. Women gained the right to vote and run for parliament. Forests and pastures were nationalized, and a literacy corps sent educated young Iranians into the countryside to teach children to read. On paper, the reforms passed with over 90% approval, though in Iranian referendums such figures always require a significant adjustment for reality. Tehran in the 1970s was a city that would shock today's visitor. It featured women in miniskirts, world-class film festivals, and the highest rate of female university enrollment in the region. There were nightclubs where live jazz played until dawn. On the surface, it looked like a triumph of modernization. But beneath the surface, a storm was gathering that the Shah failed to see. Millions of peasants who had received land found themselves without the credit or markets to sustain it, and they flooded into the cities. Tehran expanded chaotically. Slums without basic sanitation rose on the outskirts, housing a displaced population that would soon become the foot soldiers of the revolution. Meanwhile, SAVAK, the secret police created with the help of the CIA and Israel's Mossad, became one of the most feared intelligence agencies in the world. By the mid-70s, it was a machine of torture, disappearances, and a vast network of informants embedded in every university and factory. It was modernization for some and terror for others. An unlikely alliance. In these years, something existed that today's news makes almost unimaginable. Israel and Iran were allies. Iran had been the second Muslim-majority country to recognize Israel back in 1950. SAVAK and Mossad collaborated deeply, exchanging intelligence and training agents together. Israeli weapons and military advisors were present in Iran, while Iranian oil flowed to Israel. For both, it was cold pragmatism. They shared a common enemy in Arab nationalism and a common patron in the United States. It was a silent, working alliance, and as history would prove, a fragile one. The Shah lived in an information bubble. Courtiers told him only what he wanted to hear, and foreign allies saw a stable regional partner with oil, asking no uncomfortable questions. The oil boom after 1973 filled the treasury with unprecedented wealth, which the Shah spent on the military, grand infrastructure, and the celebration that would become the ultimate symbol of his detachment from reality. In 1971, amidst the desert ruins of Persepolis, the Shah hosted a banquet to celebrate 2,500 years of the Persian monarchy. 500 dignitaries, kings, presidents, and prime ministers attended. There were air-conditioned tents from Paris, catering from Maxims, and endless champagne in a Muslim country. The official cost was $100 million. The real figure was likely much higher. From exile, Khomeini sent a message: "This is a crime against Islam and the Iranian people." Most Iranians watched the spectacle on television and saw a Shah feasting with foreigners on the ruins of ancient greatness while inflation soared and slums overflowed. The distance between the throne and the people became irreversible. There are things oil billions cannot buy, and legitimacy is one of them. The spark and the fall. In 1977, Jimmy Carter became U.S. president with a rhetoric focused on human rights. Feeling the pressure, the Shah slightly loosened SAVAK's grip. It was enough for the streets to come alive. The first demonstrations were small, then larger, then nationwide. The Shah wavered between concessions and crackdowns, deciding on neither. This inconsistency was fatal. A hard regime holds power through strength, a liberal one through trust. The Shah had neither. Khomeini directed the revolution from a suburb of Paris. Through BBC Persian interviews and cassette tapes of his sermons smuggled into mosques and bazaars, he was everywhere without being physically present. The image of the ascetic old man who had renounced worldly wealth spoke of justice and dignity, a jarring contrast to the feast at Persepolis. People heard what they wanted to hear, and Khomeini was wise enough not to speak too specifically about the future. By the winter of 1978, strikes paralyzed the country. Oil workers stopped production, the bazaars closed their shops. The army, ordered to fire on the crowds, began to fracture as soldiers refused orders or defected. The Shah, secretly dying of leukemia and exhausted, decided to leave. On January 16, 1979, the Shah boarded a plane at Mehrabad Airport. Officially, it was a temporary trip for medical treatment. In reality, he would never return. Within hours, people were in the streets tearing down his portraits. A monarchy that had ruled Iran in various forms for millennia vanished in a single day. The return of the Imam. Khomeini flew back from Paris on February 1, 1981. Millions met him at the airport. On the plane, a journalist asked him, "What do you feel returning to your homeland after 14 years? Khomeini replied, "Nothing." It wasn't just coldness, it was a signal. The man who felt nothing was a man with a plan, not emotions. Initially, the revolution was a coalition. Liberals, communists, students, and clerics all claimed it as their own. Their only common bond was hatred for the Shah. But the vacuum was filled instantly. While liberals like Prime Minister Mehdi Bazargan and President Abolhassan Banisadr tried to build a modern Islamic democracy, parallel revolutionary committees began operating. These armed groups of young Islamists took over policing and the courts, answering directly to the clerics. Revolutionary tribunals began a wave of executions of former Shah officials. In November 1979, the crisis reached a breaking point. Students seized the U.S. Embassy. Khomeini, rather than condemning it, called it the Second Revolution. Bazargan resigned, and the last buffer between the government and the radical clerics vanished. Banisadr held on until 1981 before fleeing to France, reportedly disguised as a woman on a smuggled flight. One by one, every group that thought the revolution was theirs, the leftists, the liberals, the nationalists, was purged or destroyed. The radical wing won because it was willing to go further in its violence and its refusal to compromise. 444 days in a lost war. The seizure of the American embassy provided Khomeini with an invaluable tool, an external enemy. Anyone who opposed the radical line was painted as a friend of America and a traitor to the revolution. For 444 days, 52 Americans were held hostage. President Carter was trapped. A rescue mission, Operation Eagle Claw, ended in disaster in the Iranian desert. The image of crashed American helicopters became a symbol of a superpower unable to protect its own. The hostages were finally released on January 20, 1981, minutes after Ronald Reagan was sworn in. The timing was a final, calculated insult to Carter. But as the hostage crisis ended, a much bloodier trial began. Seeing Iran in chaos, Saddam Hussein ordered an attack in September 1980. He expected a quick victory. He got an 8-year war. The war became a holy defense for Iran. Thousands of young men, many from the very slums created by the Shah's failed reforms, were sent to the front. They were motivated by the promise of martyrdom. Using human wave tactics, Iran eventually pushed Iraq back, but the cost was staggering. The world stood largely behind Iraq. The U.S. provided intelligence. Western companies sold chemical weapon precursors to Saddam. When Saddam used chemical weapons against Iranian soldiers and Kurdish civilians, the international response was mere concern. Iranians would never forget this silence. By 1988, both countries were exhausted. After the U.S. Navy accidentally shot down an Iranian civilian airliner, killing 290 people, Khomeini realized he could not continue. He accepted a UN ceasefire, describing the decision as drinking a cup of poison. He died a year later. The war had not destroyed the revolution, it had cemented it. It provided the regime with a justification for absolute control and a narrative of sacrifice that persists to this day. The fortress and the double life. Khomeini left behind a system unlike any other. A republic of elected offices overseen by an unelected, supreme leader with a divine veto. This is the concept of Vilayat-e-Faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist. The supreme leader commands the military, the judiciary, and the media. Below him, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps (IRGC) grew from a militia into a massive state within a state, controlling large sectors of the economy and managing regional proxies like Hezbollah. For the average Iranian, the revolution meant an overnight transformation of life. Alcohol was banned, cinemas were burned or closed, music was silenced. Women were forced into the hijab and saw their legal rights, to divorce, to travel, to testify, halved or revoked. In response, Iranians became masters of the double life. There is the public face, regulated and compliant, and the private life, hidden behind closed doors. Behind those doors, people listen to music, watch satellite TV, and navigate the system with a culture of survival. When Khomeini died in 1989, Ali Khamenei took his place. Skeptics thought the system would collapse without its founder. They were wrong. The fortress stood. But the generations born after 1979, who know no other reality, have spent decades searching for the cracks in its walls. They do not fear the system the way their parents did because they were born inside it. They know exactly where it is weak. In a landslide victory, Mohammad Khatami, a reformist who had almost no support from the official establishment, won the presidency. He captured the hearts of the youth, women, and the urban intelligentsia. His program was built on the dialogue of civilizations, freedom of the press, civil society, and the rule of law. He spoke of something that had not been whispered aloud since 1979, that the revolution could be compatible with democracy. Millions of Iranians believed in him. However, the system was designed so that a president without the backing of the supreme leader and the Guardian Council is a man of beautiful speeches without real leverage. Reformist laws passed by the Majlis, parliament, were blocked by the Guardian Council one by one. Independent newspapers that flourished under Khatami were shuttered by judicial decrees. When the 1999 student protests, the largest since the revolution, broke out, they were suppressed by force and Khatami failed to publicly defend the protesters. The window had opened but it was slowly closing, not because someone pushed the latch but because the structure was never built to have windows. The return to the fortress. In 2005, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad became president. He was a populist with simple language, anti-Western rhetoric, and an appeal to the poor and conservative. His victory was a signal from the system to itself. Reforms had gone too far. It was time to return to the roots. The nuclear program, which had progressed quietly under Khatami, became a point of national pride and a centerpiece of Ahmadinejad's daily speeches. Iran chose the fortress again. But inside that fortress, a generation had grown up that knew the internet, remembered Khatami and refused to go back. In 2009, the presidential election results declared Ahmadinejad the winner by a margin that seemed impossible even by Iranian standards. Millions took to the streets of Tehran wearing green ribbons, the color of reformist Mir Hossein Mousavi's campaign. "Where is my vote?" became the cry on every banner. These were the largest protests since 1979. The system responded as it knew best: arrests, torture, and executions. The reformist leadership was placed under house arrest, where some would remain for years. Shadow wars and cyber weapons. While the drama unfolded in the streets, another invisible technical drama was occurring. Iranian centrifuges for uranium enrichment at Natanz began experiencing strange failures. They broke down one after another without visible cause. It was later revealed to be Stuxnet, a computer virus developed by American and Israeli intelligence. It was the first cyber weapon in history to cause physical damage to real-world infrastructure. The nuclear program became the center of international pressure. The UN Security Council passed resolution after resolution, and the US and EU introduced sanctions that gradually cut Iran off from the international financial system. Iranian banks were excluded from SWIFT, oil revenues plummeted, and the rial devalued. The Iranian middle class felt the weight every day in the price of food and the unavailability of imported medicine. Meanwhile, Israel conducted a shadow war of targeted assassinations. Leading nuclear physicists were shot or bombed in the streets of Tehran. Iran blamed Mossad. Israel remained silent. The Viennese gamble. In 2013, Hassan Rouhani, a moderate cleric with a mandate to negotiate, was elected president. He was sent to Vienna with authority no Iranian negotiator had held before. After 20 months of grueling talks and missed deadlines, Foreign Minister Javad Zarif and U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry announced the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action (JCPOA) in July 2015. Iran agreed to slash its enriched uranium stockpiles and submit to intense IAEA inspections. In return, the West lifted sanctions. That night, Tehran celebrated. It wasn't an organized government rally, it was a spontaneous outburst of relief. People honked horns and embraced in the streets. For the first time since 1979, Iran had taken a conscious step toward openness through compromise rather than defeat. For 3 years, European companies returned, Airbus signed contracts, and tourism grew. But the trust was paper-thin. In May 2018, Donald Trump announced the U.S. withdrawal from the deal. Sanctions returned, harsher than before. The rial, which traded at 35,000 to the dollar in 2015, collapsed toward 1.4 million by the end of 2025. The modern crisis, 2020 to 2026. The pages of history from here are being written in blood. In January 2020, a U.S. strike in Baghdad killed General Qasem Soleimani, the architect of Iran's regional proxy network. Iran responded with missiles at U.S. bases, and in the chaos of battle alert, an Iranian surface-to-air missile accidentally shot down Ukraine International Airlines Flight 752, killing everyone on board. The government's initial denial and eventual confession sparked furious internal outrage. In 2022, the death of a young Kurdish woman, Mahsa Amini, in the custody of the morality police, sparked the Woman Life Freedom protests. Women removed their hijabs in public, a direct challenge to the regime's identity. By 2025 and early 2026, the situation escalated into direct strikes between Iran and Israel. In June 2025, Israel struck Iranian nuclear sites, with the U.S. joining the fray. The same hand that tore up the 1985 diplomacy signed the order for strikes in 2026. To Irans, what does it mean to live in Iran today? It means planning your life in foreign currency because the rial devalues faster than you can spend it. It means using a VPN for every social interaction. It means a double life, the hijab in the bag until the moment you exit the apartment, satellite dishes hidden on rooftops, and a cynical awareness that while the people suffer under sanctions, the children of the elite study in London, Toronto, and Vienna. The fortress is built for the people. The doors are always slightly ajar for the powerful. Why does the world fear Iran? Not because Iranians are inherent enemies, but because the system built in 1979 learned to survive through confrontation, just as the Safavids survived through isolation. An external enemy justifies the walls of the fortress. But there is another Iran. The Iran that writes poetry and films world-class cinema despite sanctions. The Iran where girls remove hijabs not just as a protest but as a choice. This Iran is the true descendant of a civilization that once absorbed its conquerors and turned them into Persians. It is still there, living inside the fortress, knocking on the walls from within. Iran is not a country you can understand through a single headline. It is a civilization that has twice changed its survival strategy and still hasn't decided which is right. Openness or fortress? Absorption or isolation? Cyrus or Ismail? Mossadegh or Khomeini? The price of these recurring choices is paid by millions of people who simply want to live. This narrative wasn't meant to offer an excuse for the regime, but to offer an understanding of the nation. The Iranian people are not a synonym for their government. Behind every headline are people with 1,000-year memory, their own tragedies and their own hopes.